So when Mark gets here, I'll introduce you.
I am not Mark. Lori Ware. You're the greatest.
Well, thanks for coming.
Mike Stepanovich. Hi. I was like, it's at my wedding too. Grandma! Oh, hi! Hi!
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Walter Stiern Library. I'm Kurt Asher. I'm Dean of the Library, and this is our first Walter Presents event of the new school year. We're here to listen to and participate in a discussion by two people whose expertise on the subject of water is well known to all of us. We're also here to celebrate the publication of a book by one of the region's most esteemed writers. We have a signing table where Mark will sign, right? He'll sign books after, okay, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay, he'll sign books later this evening. Tonight's talk is being live streamed and can be accessed from the library's webpage. Just click on events and find the live link there for anyone who's not here and not talking to us on television over there. I want to thank our library team, the events office, and our Public Affairs Officer Jennifer Self, as well as Miriam Vivian, for getting this event rolling. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to tell you about a few upcoming events in the library. Next Wednesday, October 9th, in honor of Pride Week, we'll be hosting a pizza lunch with speaker Natasha Pinckney from the Center for Sexuality and Gender Diversity, and she'll discuss the differences between gender identity and sexual orientation. On Monday, October 14th at 6 p.m., we're sponsoring a California Writer Series event. We're co-sponsoring a California Writer Series event with award-winning poet Lindsay Wilson. The following night on the 15th, that's a Tuesday at 6, we're bringing LA Roots music historian and producer Scott B. Bomar to campus to discuss the Bakersfield Sound. Scott is releasing a comprehensive 10 CD set of the Bakersfield Sound from its earliest days to the present. A lot of you might be interested in that. And he'll be interviewed on stage by journalist Bob Price. By coincidence, this event occurs exactly 10 years after Bob conducted an on-stage interview with Merle Haggard on campus here. So please RSVP for this event if you plan to attend. On Thursday, October 17th, we're hosting Curator Emeritus of Literary Manuscripts from the Huntington and a Jack London scholar, Sue Hodson. So it's a busy month for us. We've got a lot of stuff going on. If you didn't get that written down and are interested in any of those events, you can be on our mailing list. Just sign up. It's by the front door. So now on to tonight's guests. Mark Arax is a Fresno native. He's written extensively about the other Californian of the Central Valley. First as a journalist for the LA Times and the California Sunday Magazine, and then as the author of several books, including The King of California, which won the California Book Award and the William Saroyan Prize from Stanford University. His latest work, Dreamt Land. Mark's gifts are on full display as he tells the story of the land and the people who have worked it, from gold miners to wheat ranchers to small fruit farmers to today's big ag. He explores the relationship between big ag and California's constant quest for water and the resulting power structures that have shaped the valley for decades. Also a Fresno native, Lois Henry spent nearly 30 years of her career at the Bakersfield Californian, where she worked to hold leaders and what?
Oh, nothing. I said it sounds like a jail sentence.
She worked to hold leaders and Valley power brokers accountable for in her award-winning Watchdog column. Her decades-long reporting on the opaque and Byzantine world of water, Lois has designated herself as a preeminent authority on the topic and has used her skill as a writer to keep the public informed. Just last month, Lois launched the SJV Water, a nonprofit journalism website devoted to water. So please welcome tonight's speakers.
Do you want us to bring this? Oh, okay. I see.
Thank you. How many of you were planning to come here to see Bernie and just
Yeah.
couldn't see him and came here? Anybody? No Bernie fans in Bakersfield? How about how many of you are here under duress because the professor said you got to be here?
I saw one
Yeah,
hand.
that's it. Okay. Oh, good. We got a crowd that's here and willing. Yeah.
Well, of course, because it's water. And water's exciting. Okay, so we talked about, we're not going to do a big presentation, I don't think. We're just sort of going to talk. Mark and I have, if you let us, we'll talk water until you all just have bleeding ears and want to run away. So we're just going to try and keep this, I don't know, as in-depth or as light. I don't know how we're going to do it. But one of the things, okay, so I covered water for a lot of years at the Bakersfield Californian when I could, although I did have an editor who will remain nameless, who said water was boring and I shouldn't cover it. But anyway, and I tried to understand the sort of ins and outs as far as it was going on here. But Mark he's much more macro, and he kind of looks at this whole sort of scape, this waterscape on a larger level. And one of the things that I wanted to ask him, and we talked a little bit about this tonight before he got here, is how he ended up with the book he ended up with. Because I will tell you that, 5-6 years ago, he called me. I had done a story about the Central Valley Project, and there was a lawsuit that was going on from Arvin Edison. And in that lawsuit story, there was some history about how the Central Valley Project came to pass, et cetera. And so Mark called me, and he was talking about it and saying, I think I might want to do a book about the Central Valley Project and how that kind of came to be. And the next thing I know, he comes out with Dreamt Land, and it's like this massive look at sort of the whole thing. And so I always kind of wanted to know, like, how did you go from this little idea of the history of the CVP, which could be contained, into this really uncontained, fun ramble through the whole?
It's sprawling.
Yeah, it's great, and it's wonderful.
So all my books are an attempt to try to educate myself about place, so whether the place was Fresno, the San Joaquin Valley, the Central Valley, California. And I always start in the middle, which is my home. This book starts in my backyard with my 3 apricot trees. So can I talk about my apricot trees?
Please do.
So I have 3 different varieties, and one is a Blenheim, and it comes early. Then I have one in the middle that comes middle. Then I have this one at the end that sometimes comes, sometimes doesn't. And I make this Armenian sun jam out of it. So in the middle of the drought, the trees started blossoming in early January. And you know, what to call this season, okay? They were a month early. But they set very nicely into those little nubs. And I thought, wow, I'm going to make some nice Armenian sun jam. I even started counting up my mason jars and everything else. And then I went out it was March. And I check on them every so often, talk to them and, whatever you do. And I looked, and I had to take a second look because the trees were weightless. And I thought, wait. I went closer, and as I got up to the trees, there were these huge piles at the trunk, and I couldn't find an apricot anywhere. So, my first thought was my son used to throw batting practice back there, but no batting practice and hitting would have done that. Squirrels, possums, nothing. And it was a mass shedding. So I ended up calling my friend, and he's a almond grower and a pistachio grower, and at the time he was growing about 10,000 acres, and he always lets me indulge this idea that my backyard farm has anything to do with, the agriculture he's doing out there. I said, hey, I'm seeing this back here. He goes, yeah, I'm seeing some of that out here. So I said, Brad, my apricots, they're all gone. I can't figure out what happened. And he said, I'm coming over right now. I'm going to show you my nuts. That line got changed in the book a little bit.
It's not that kind of meeting.
No. It was, I think we had to put pistachios in there. So I hop in his truck. We drive along the river. We go to the vast west side of Fresno, and we go to this place not far from where Joaquin Murrieta met his end, okay? And he's in this Pleasant Valley water district. He's planted these pistachios. And he takes a big stick. He leads me into the orchard. And if those of you who know a pistachio orchard, there's one male for every 24 female. And the farmers have a kind of odd sense of humor. They paint the trunk of the female rooster red. And so he starts spanking the hanging green pods of these of the males, and no dust is coming off. And then he says, my females are ready. They've been ready for 3 weeks. The males are nowhere near. And he said, I've never seen my orchard this out of sync in 35 years. I said, what is it? And he hesitated and scuffed his boot into the dirt. And he said, it's climate change. We're not getting the tule fog that we used to. We're not getting the winters anymore. So your pomegranate trees, your apricot trees indeed have something to do with my pistachios. We didn't get enough chilling hours. And I remember something my grandfather told me when I was a kid. He said, the fruit tree has to know the death of winter to be able to produce life in spring. So these trees were never fully put to sleep. And that's why the apricot aborted that way. And that's why he had to bring in artificial pollen. So the next thing I know, I hear these three-wheelers going through the orchard. And from the back of these, the blow rigs that gardeners have, he was blowing artificial male pollen into the females. And he said it would take 3 weeks to figure out if this is a match. And I think he had a good crop that year. So it started with climate change in my backyard, and then it worked out. Okay. Long answer, that's it.
Okay.
So that's why it involved all this other stuff besides just water.
Yeah, and I was kind of envisioning what your living room or house must look like. The amount of research that you've done in that book is phenomenal. Do you do it online? Do you just have stacks and stacks of books? Do you have
stacks of
old
books,
guys on speed dial that you
Yeah.
What it's like?
No, at the end of the book, when the thing's all done, I end up, these piles start talking to me. Really talking to me.
Okay.
And then I'm getting visited by J.G. Boswell and Henry Miller and Ollie Ben Hagen, and they're telling me, you're finished. But yeah, I was bunkered for 5 years, and it just kept growing. And my two sons got kind of tired of it. But yeah, it's books, archival stuff, some online research, tapes that I had to transcribe. So it's
do you feel like you ended up with the book that you started off with?
Oh no, it was entirely different. I knew that water has a capacity to put all of us asleep, and I didn't want anybody dying in the middle of this story. So I knew that I had to bring in my family story, memoir, reportage, on the land, history. The first 5 chapters are present day. We're talking about the kind of a madness that's happening on the land. The land is sinking, and we have the old photo of Joe Poland, where he's standing next to a telephone pole. And he's a USGS scientist in the 70s, That's when he retired. For 20 years, 30 years, he was documenting the sinking of the land. No one was paying attention. So he thought, I have to do a stunt here to get people to pay attention. So I think he was inspired by an old comic called Ripley's Believe It or Not, where there were these weird kind of phenomena, right? So he stands next to a telephone pole, and that telephone pole shows how much the land of the west side of Fresno has sunk in the 30, 40 years. It's stunning to see. It's the length of the telephone pole. So all that is happening, and then at some point it occurs to me that, wait, there's obviously the seeds of this began somewhere else, and that's when we go back into the past, to the first taking of the resource in California, which is the taking of the body of the indigenous. It was through the taking of the native that we were able to then take the first rivers, build the first dams. So that extraction culture that we're going to talk about really began with the effacing, the wiping out of the Indian culture. But before they were wiped out, they were captured for their labor, of course.
Some people have labeled the book anti-ag. Tell me what your thoughts are on that.
No, I don't think it's I don't think anything I've written is anti-ag. I mean, my grandfather came here as a fruit picker and became a vineyardist, raisins. I think anytime you write about ag, it can be seen as unusual because the farmers don't like telling their story. They have a wonderful story to tell. It has complications and a downside, but I mean, it's a great story. So 100 pages of this book is devoted to Stuart Resnick and the wonderful empire. He's now the biggest farmer in America, and he's using more water. He and his wife are using more water than any couple in the state. And he had never told his story before. And so it took me 10 years of kind of back and forth conversations with him to get him to tell the story. He told it in a little bit here and there. Some people have read that and thought it was a negative portrait because he's living in Beverly Hills and farming in Lost Hills, and those two places obviously couldn't be more different. And the company, it's kind of a modern day company town. And so I really explore all the layers of that, from the farm workers, the people in the community, to the Resnicks themselves, their past, what brought them to agriculture. He's not a farmer. He's never put his foot on the shoulder of a shovel. He doesn't know his Washington navel trees from his Valencia trees. He couldn't tell you any of that, but he's a businessman. And so, we delve into his thing. And I think it's a very complex portrait. So to put it in a kind of negative or positive, I think it's somewhere in that muddy middle.
What has the reaction from agriculture been?
Well, I have even Resnick. I mean, when some of that piece appeared in a magazine, he was fine with it. His wife wasn't. But I tell the story of the Pandals, for instance, Jack Pandal, who's bending. This is all about bending and manipulation. So we bent the body of the Indian. We bent the first rivers to extract gold. At some point, the extraction of gold was silting up the rivers, and California had a choice in the 1880s: were we going to continue to mine gold or were we going to mine soil? And there was an environmental lawsuit in the 1880s. It was decided that California, that one industry couldn't pollute another. And so California essentially then moved down the mountain and started mining the soil. And the very same industrialists who made the most money on gold, they became the first planters of wheat in the middle of California. They lived in Nob Hill in San Francisco, and they farmed their wheat in the middle, not unlike Mr. Resnick is doing with Beverly Hills and then up and over the mountain to the valley. So, you see this lettering. Nothing is new here. It's all been going on.
Well, that's what I was struck by as I was reading the book is so much of everything that has happened that you document is continuing to happen to this day in real time. SB 1, which failed, but Proposition 3, which was, and SB 559, these are all attempts to either curtail pumping or get money to fix infrastructure to increase water deliveries. I mean, it's very fascinating to me. Reading your book was sort of like you have to kind of keep two things going at once: your history and then what's happening.
Right? Yeah. I mean, that's why I'm moving back and forth in time.
Did you intend for that to happen? Because so many of these things came up
No,
as I was reading it.
No, I think what you do is you cast a big wide net out there, bringing in everything you can, and then as you're writing, you're finding an organization, you're finding a story. This is just a big fat story is what this is. I kind of imagine it as a novel, trying to write it in a novelistic way. So, no, it's not really about water. It's about man and women and the land and the water. It's just all this big stuff and the taking and what is sustainable and what isn't, even though that word is kind of an odd word. But there is, back in the 1920s, there was this debate. A UC professor came to the valley. He was putt-putting in a Model T Ford up and down the valley saying that the growth that was happening then wasn't sustainable. So I think we ought to talk a little bit about that footprint of ag going out, what you're talking about. So the mining of wheat, the mining of the soil didn't work. That monoculture robbed too much from the ground, and so we were producing more wheat than any spot in the world. Isaac Friedlander was the wheat king. He was 6'7". He weighed over 300 pounds. He lived on Nob Hill, as I said. He had this so dialed in that he had these clipper ships that would end up delivering the wheat to Liverpool. And Europe went crazy over California wheat. I think they called it white velvet. But the fertility got robbed, the production went down, and then we see another transition. It's not gold to wheat, now it's wheat to fruit trees, nut trees, vegetables. We see the selling of LA, the myth of LA through the Washington Naval. This is when my grandfather arrives in 1920. So those first farmers took the flow of the rivers, right? And we had a huge case here that also went up to the highest levels between Henry Miller, the cattle king, and Ali Ben Hagen, who was the third richest man in the world at the time. And he was a part Turkish and part aristocratic patrician southerner, and he comes here and he owns all this land, and these two guys are fighting over the ownership of the river. I mean, Miller owns essentially both sides of the San Joaquin River for 50, 60 miles. And then he buys the west end of the Kern River as it's flowing, and it's all for his cattle. And it ends up flooding his land and then growing the grass that he feeds his cattle. But what happens is that upstream, Ali Ben Hagen starts buying these points where he can divert the water and send it into canals. And so all of a sudden, he's shipping water far from the river. So we have a fight between these two kinds of water law. Riparian water law, which is owning the banks of the river and being able to control that water by that, and then somebody having appropriative rights, which is I have a canal company that early on has tapped into this river. And so we have this fight going on, and California decides to have two kinds of laws, a combination of two things which are on their face contradictory. That's our water law. So these are these magnificent characters that come and go, and we see the fruit culture rise, and they've taken the rivers. Now, these early farmers, small and big, did not decide to take 50, 60% of the rivers, which would have made for a healthier environment. There would have been water still in the rivers. The glut of agriculture wouldn't happen as often, but they ended up taking 90 to 95% of the flow. I mean, we've gotten all used to it. You drive down 99 most of the year, you cross the San Joaquin River, it's dry. You cross the Kings River, it's dry. The Tule, then you come to the Kern and it's dry. There's a picture, I think, in the opening of this book of the Kern River. It's just a bunch of sand underneath a freeway pass. So they took all that flow, and they grew up in agriculture, but that wasn't enough. So the turbine pump came in 1920, and it allowed them to grow agriculture more. So they took the best land, the alluvial land with the river flow, then they expanded out to more marginal land with the pumping. And now today, because of of drip irrigation, they can plant anywhere. And so we're seeing almonds and pistachios going uphill. Furrow irrigation could never take you uphill. We're seeing ag land, trees and orchards go on ground that is third and fourth rate, where nothing should be grown. The drip irrigation allows you to take a certain precise dose of water and also a certain precise dose of chemical and grow a tree in very poor ground, almost like hydroponic farming. So that footprint that Lois was referring to, it's gone out, and it's gone out to a point that's no longer sustainable.
So speaking of which, I feel like I need to ask you some questions that somebody emailed me, but we now have SGMA, which is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, that is going to attempt to put some balance back into our groundwater pumping. And there's also rumblings, although I haven't heard anything recently since the drought, about changing our water rights systems. Because a lot of these rights that you're talking about, where people took the river and, Henry Miller and Hagen and their descendants, or their districts that are their descendants, have pre-1914 rights that were established before.
They were the early, like the Boswells,
right,
took all that flow into Tulare Lake because they got here early.
And there's some rumbling that, should that be the way should that go into the future of a modern state? And so what do you think of all that? What do you think of the future of water and use and ownership? And do you think we're going to get into marketing like Australia?
So it took the state of California 165 years to regulate groundwater. We have this reputation of being on the cutting edge of all environmental things, environmental rights, environmental protection. But when it came to groundwater, one of the last states to protect it. And so now we have this law, and, the same thing on growth, by the way, housing tracts. The state has no involvement in that. We let the locals decide growth. The problem with that is there's so much corruption at the local level. These
We do have a Bakersfield City Council member here.
That's all right. That's all right. No, he's not. But he's no. We're not talking about him. But when you look at scandals on a local basis across the country, they almost always involve local elected officials and developers. So the state of California has decided that they're not going to tell the locals how to build. And I'll tell a little story later when I went up to Paradise and saw what we had built, on a ridge. So there's not that regulation. They gave them 20 years to decide how to regulate it. And now the farmers are coming up with these models. And you've been in some of these meetings. And the question is, will the state of California be able to push back on the modeling? Because some of the big farmers are controlling some of these sustainability models. And when I met with very high water folks in Kern County during the drought, they told me that 900,000 acres are being farmed in Kern County.
Right, we have 900,000 irrigated acres here in Kern County.
And there's no county that has more of a deficit water take than Kern. If you look at all the flows coming in and all that, we're not going to get into all that math, but it's quite a deficit. I said, what is sustainable here? And he said, probably 450 to 500,000 acres, maybe 550. So we're looking, if this law goes into effect and the state holds the locals' feet to the fire, we're looking at probably 300 to 350,000 acres that will go idle in Kern. And it will be the land that is not on alluvial ground, good ground. It won't be the land that's using river water or even good groundwater. It'll be the land that's gone out into these areas that probably should have never been farmed in the first place. Now you add those up county by county, we have 6 million acres in the San Joaquin Valley, and if that law goes into effect the way it was designed to, it'll probably come down to 4.5 million. So we're looking at
4.5 million left
acres.
farming, or 4.5 million going out of production
no,
out of 6 million?
1.5 million will go out of production.
Okay. Just want to clarify that. Not to plug SJV Water, which is my new website, but that is my first story that's going to be on SJV
Lois
Water.
is the only one. You know, all these decisions happen in irrigation districts and now Sigma, and no one attends. I remember going to an irrigation district meeting in Lost Hills, and they stopped the meeting when I walked in. They said, "What are you doing here?" I said, I'm a writer, and I'm writing a book." And they were flummoxed, and they said,
Stop it.
we need to break here. They went into executive session behind closed doors, and it was decided that I could stay. Okay.
Magnanimous.
Yeah. So no one's walking. This is where the decisions are made, these irrigation district meetings. No one walks into them. Lois walks into them. Tell us about some of the, no, that'll be you stepping on your story, I guess.
No.
No, go ahead.
No, I went to, because I'm just starting the website, so I went to the Kern Groundwater Authority meeting last week just to hand out business cards and get back into it. I've been out of it for 2 weeks, right? And all of a sudden, from the chair of the Kern Groundwater Authority, they said, "Look, we've looked at these water budgets that you guys have turned in, and
The plans, the early plans on sustainability.
plans on how to attain sustainability, and to make those plans, you have to say, well, how much water do we have, and how much water is going out, and you have to have water budgets, right? So that's what they were looking at, is water budgets. And this guy says, clearly you've used your paperwork to create water. And the state is not going to take these phony numbers. I mean, I'm not making this up. They said phony numbers. They said no one in this room even believes this is true. I don't think they saw me there because it was like a packed room, and I came in late and I'm short. So I don't think they saw me there. But I was like, wow, this is, I mean, they're getting very serious about it. And then the other thing, of course, and the reason I asked you about rights is because, and I do notice that the city is here tonight, Councilmember Bob Smith, and he's also on the water board. The city of Bakersfield owns rights to the Kern River. It owns the riverbed, and it owns rights to the Kern River. It bought it from Tenneco West. And now that these sustainability plans are getting rubber to the road, and everybody's counting every molecule of water, there are a lot of people, water districts, that are looking at the city's water saying, well, you run that down the Kern Riverbed, and that becomes natural seepage, so we get to count that as ours. And
Yeah.
the city's like, oh, no, you don't. And there have been lawyers that have written some nice letters back and forth, and I just wonder how long it's going to be nice, because I watched two water guys at an open house just also last week get into a it was getting heated, and there were people yelling, why do you care about our water? This isn't your water. And I mean, it's going to get interesting. So
Yeah. I can't wait to read that story.
I sent it to you.
I know you did.
Just ignoring me.
But then you sent a second version of it. So
Well, there's
I'm
a
waiting for
fourth
the third.
version,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
don't read that one. Read this one.
I happen to think water marketing is also good, but it has to have some constraints. So some of the farmers on the west side of Fresno, when they were getting zero deliveries from the federal project, and some from the state project were getting zero deliveries in those worst years, they went up to the rice growers in Sacramento, who even in the drought were still water rich, and they went to Gridley and places like that, and they negotiated some sales of water. Now, it was tough getting it through the Delta, because the Delta has environmental restrictions. Certain times of the year they want to limit that pumping to save the salmon and the smelt and other species, okay? But that made sense because the nut guys were making a lot of money on their almonds and pistachios. The rice guys were not making very good money. And so the almond guys basically went up there, flew up there, went in the meetings and said, be our partners. And so they sold some of this water for $500 and $600 an acre foot, which was not as expensive as it really got in the drought. Some water was bought and sold. Mr. Vidovich, I think there was like $1,400 an acre foot.
Right.
So I like that. What makes me nervous about water marketing, though, is that the deepest pockets are always going to win on that. And so the big farmers will beat the little farmers. The hedge funds and investment funds that are coming in and farming the land here more and more from back east, pension funds, they'll win that game. So that makes me a little nervous. And then it also makes me nervous that developers will win that game. The last thing I want to see in the San Joaquin, I think we need to have a smaller footprint of agriculture here. More environmentally sound, not so much going from glut to glut and then bust to boom, a more sustainable, again, we're using that word, we'll have to find a better word, kind of farming. But the last thing I want to see is ag water going to suburbia. We've seen that already. Is the valley going to become another San Fernando Valley? And this is this thing that's constantly pulling at my story. What's going to become of this place? And I have a lot of my friends, many of them liberals, who are in favor of the train, the high-speed rail train. The high-speed rail train makes me very nervous because when you start reducing those commute times between the valley and the job centers like Silicon Valley and LA and San Francisco, you're going to see more and more people who are working in San Francisco, working in Silicon Valley, living here on the edge. And I saw that in LA, in a place called Moreno Valley. It was the weirdest place. It was actually a town. People would leave at 3, 4 in the morning and commute. They'd come back 9, 10 at night, exhausted. And there was no community going on. Now, on weekends, you might find a little life. But no, there was it wasn't really a community. And I was driving down I-5 the other day for a book event in San Francisco, and right there in Patterson, the apricot capital of the world, was this new development there. Have you seen that?
Yeah, and I was going to say Tracy's already had major growing pains because of the commute, because it's right over the hill from Hayward.
So I'm a big farm. The soil is unique here. The Mediterranean climate is unique here. Yes, we qualify as a desert when it comes to rain, but what kind of desert is that? We're at we're right there at the Sierra. All these rivers coming down. So it's perfect for agriculture. Agriculture has a lot of issues. Pesticide use, we swore that every cotton season when they defoliated, we'd get sick. The defoliant flu. I don't know if any of you got, but it was like clockwork. So when the almond trees came to replace the cotton, I thought, wow, we're going to get a break here. But then you see this almond harvest creating all this dust. I was talking to my almond buddy the other day. Yeah. And I said, what are you guys going to do about this? He said, well, there's a machine. It's made in Spain, but it's a little too expensive right now. But ultimately, I think they'll be going to that. So I would like to see ag continue here in a strong way. I'd like to see Tulare Lake maybe come back to life too, some of it, okay? Pipe dream maybe. But I remember when it came back in 97. It was magnificent. That was the genesis of the King of California. I had a friend at the Sacramento Bureau of the LA Times. He called and said...
His other book is The King of California,
yeah.
In case anybody doesn't know.
Yeah, no, he'd said something about it up there, yeah. And
I
wasn't assuming that anybody, necessarily knew about it, but he covered it. So I get a call from the Sacramento Bureau friend. He says, Tulare Lake has come back to life. I said, Tulare Lake, what's that? He said, you have a map? I said, sure. So I pulled out the map, and he says, trace your finger down like this, and then I got to near Corcoran, and yes, there was a lake on this map. It was square, okay? The rivers had no bend as they came into there. They had straitjackets on. This is the level of engineering that these guys had done. And so I drove out. Highway 43, all these roads came up to this embankment, this dirt embankment, a levee, a dike, something out of the Mississippi Delta or the Florida Everglades. And I walked up, and as I walked up, I got dizzy with vertigo. The smell changed in the air. I look out, it's an inland sea. The whitecaps, the wind is moving whitecaps, and the speed with which nature found itself was stunning. All these waterfowl, fish had come back. And then I looked at the telephone poles, and you could see these marks of water on them from the past floods. And so that became, what was this lake? It was the biggest body of fresh water west of the Mississippi. 4 Yokut tribes lived along there. The women fished the shallow parts of it with their toes. They fished clams and mussels. Then the Chinese fishermen came in, the industrial fishermen, and took up with these huge nets all this terrapin, turtle, and they served turtle soup at the finest San Francisco restaurants. That was all basically drained by the southern cotton plantation. The cotton fields of the South had the boll weevil ravaging their fields. These growers came west to Tulare Lake and started draining that land through early canals and stuff. And that was that story. So, anyhow.
I used to be able to do steamships all the way up to San Francisco from
Yeah.
Tulare Lake.
Actually, you could go Kern in a flood year. You could go Kern River to, I think, Kern to Tulare Lake, because they fed in all the way to the bay.
I think maybe it wasn't in 97, maybe it was a flood before that. We had a guy who kayaked from the Kern River all the way up to San Francisco.
Yeah.
We were in a flood year. 70? But one of those big flood years.
Hooper and John Sweetser did that.
Oh, they
Yeah.
did?
But that was in the 30s, wasn't it, or no? No? Yeah, Latta did. Yeah, Latta was something. I've stolen a lot from Latta. He's a magnificent backyard historian who got all those things down, I give him credit, though.
So what's next for you? I mean, is it more water?
No. I after The King of California, which I did with a partner, Rick Wartzman, I was on that book for a year. He was covering the Clinton White House for the Wall Street Journal. And he said, how's that book going? I said, this is going to take me 10 years. And so, and I said, a lot of it takes place in Washington, the building of the dams and stuff. So he said, let me go do a little work. I'll pull some documents for you next time back there. Next thing I know, he delivered 3-4 boxes. And I said, let's join up on this one. And so we did. It took us 5 years, 2 guys. And, but I never wanted to touch water again. I thought, it's too hard to write water. First of all, you got to explain what acre feet are.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Because your book is not, to me, your book is not a water geek book.
No.
And I'm a water geek,
God, please,
right?
that would be.
And so
no.
how do you, how did you make it accessible and,
You just got to write the heck out of it. You got to write it, you just got to write you got to write stories, and you got to write, make it sing. It's got to be like,
Oh, that's easy to say.
Yeah, it's not, yeah. And then you throw yourself in there and all that. I mean, I have my grandparents in the thing. My grandmother telling me we sold our last ranch before I was born. They moved into the suburbs. And when I was growing up, they lived off of Garland in Fresno, where a huge irrigation ditch came through the neighborhood. She said, never go near there. She said, when you get to the top, you'll get dizzy and fall in. And you'll be like all those poor Mexican kids who drown in the canals in summer. And she said, no one will come to fish out your body until the end of the growing season. I never did go near the irrigation ditches. But I grew up dumb to these things. I mean, I never asked myself, why is an irrigation canal knifing through our neighborhood? Where's the water coming from? Who's it going to? And by what right? I mean, we never asked ourselves these questions. You're dumb to your place. And I guess all my books are an attempt to, hopefully by the time I'm done writing, done living, I'll have become less dumb to this place. I'm just asking questions. How'd this get here? How'd this happen? In visiting Jack Pandal, we talked about the bending of the land, the bending of the rivers. Jack now is bending grapes. It's like Luther Burbank did, who was the great bender of all. He developed the Shasta daisy. He developed the finest plum, the Santa Rosa. I have one growing in my yard. All these varieties. And Jack is now doing this with grapes, and some of it's a little weird. I mean, you go out in his vineyard and it's like Willy Wonka. He's throwing you these flavors of things, and you get a cotton candy grape. You get a grape. They're all weird, but they're there's one that he borrows a lot from the genes of muscats, East Coast varieties, and doing these kinds of things. It's fun to tell.
That was really fun part of the book. How did you find these people, like the citronella grower and the guy with the mandolin? I mean, it's just like on and on and on, these characters that you could just sort of lose yourself in their story forever, and how they've used the water to develop these amazing products. And the Delight, I loved the Delight guy.
Oh, the Delight guy. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. The Delight guy is his name is Tom Mulholland. So what we have.
I mean, it's just amazing. You can't make this stuff up.
Right. So his grandpa was the Mulholland that was instrumental in the first theft of a river in California, which became the example for all the other thefts that happened. And here we find Tom, 3-4 generations later, up and over the mountain, growing a kind of mandarin that really beat the cutie and the halo, but he just didn't have the marketing heft to pull it off. But there's the Mulholland story. And then you go a little deeper into the citrus belt along the east side of the valley, and you'll find Lauren Booth, who's one of the biggest citrus growers in California. And her father was Otis Booth, and Otis was a chandler. Okay, and he just invested in farmland and really had nothing to do with it. He had these custom farmers farming it. But Lauren was interested in the ground, and so she taught herself, and you go out there. So you see the LA story come up and over. So it's all these connections, and that's why the book weighs 2.2 pounds.
Okay.
We're gonna have some room. I love when we have questions. We could get to have questions. Yeah. But go ahead. You have a question?
Well, I had a couple of different questions. Well, I can answer this one, but this guy's talking about the Stuart Resnick, wonderful company, ends up with ownership of such a large, vast amount of water, and he's saying how can that happen, and what is the current situation?
So, Resnick's farming empire is in Western Kern. Western Kern has no river really running through that part of it, and Western Kern has no good groundwater. So he is wholly reliant on the State Water Project and the Kern Water Bank. Now, the Kern Water Bank is a separate story told in, I think, Chapter 5 here. Chapter 5, I'm visiting, Luigi's restaurant, and I'm going various places trying to figure out what's going on in Kern. And So Resnick gets control of the Kern Water Bank, and there's a whole controversy around that. You can read the book. But how does he survive? Well, when those flows of the Kern River, when those flows of the aqueduct dry up, he has to rely on the bank. But in the drought, the bank was even at zero. So I drive out to Resnick's land, and I'm seeing this record crop on his trees. How can that be in the midst of this drought? And that's when I find that he has teamed up with Vidovich, a billionaire himself, or close to it, and they've devised this scheme where they're pumping groundwater a couple counties away out of an aquifer that's really overused and the land is sinking, and they're shipping it via canals and ditches and rain-for-rent pipes into Resnick's fields. Fascinating stuff. So
this guy wants to know what the current situation
yeah,
is.
the current situation is Resnick had to downsize during the drought coming out of it. He took out acres of pomegranates, took out some old almonds, but he's growing again. If you go east of Highway 65, I think it's probably Resnick, or it might be the cutie guy, because Resnick's now Halo. But they're planting 1,000 acres of citrus right there where no river runs. So they're growing again. And what he learned from the drought is he does not want to be in a situation where he's relying on one source of water, be it a river, be it a federal or state system, be it the aquifer. He wants to have 2 to 3 sources of water. So he's growing all the time. Did you guys read that Resnick gave $10 million to Cal State Fresno? Well, Cal State Fresno got $10 million. It's one of the reasons I have not been invited to present I'm a Fresno boy. I'm persona non grata at Fresno State. Like, they don't, because, whatever. Then $750 million to Caltech to fight climate change. And NPR call wanting me to kind of comment on that. And I said, listen, the Resnicks are complicated folks. I mean, no farming enterprise has done more for the people. It took them 35 years to figure out what to do in their company town, but now they're doing things that no farmer's ever done. And it's not just Linda writing checks or Stuart writing checks. Linda's designing these charter schools. She's designing the health programs that are trying to persuade folks to change their diets so we can fight among the farm workers obesity and diabetes. Now, some of it goes a little far into the realm of social engineering. She doesn't want Mexican families to eat tortillas anymore. She says that a tortilla is like a can of Coke. That's kind of tough. So a complex portrait of folks where they're going, they're just going to, I think, end up continuing to get bigger. When I started this book, Resnick was worth $4.5 billion. He's worth $9 billion today.
You think they're going to get bigger? What about the line of succession for the Resnicks?
There is no line of succession.
That's
The
the
kids don't
interesting-
want. So that's the big question at the end of the
Right.
book. Where's this going to go? And well, they just gave $1 billion of it away. So
The same thing with Vidovich. He's growing massively.
Take some questions?
yeah, I'd love to have
Okay.
questions. It's the best part.
Mark, if you could dictate what crops would be grown in the valley, what would you grow?
I'm going to upset my Azorean Portuguese friends and say that the dairy cow does not belong on mega farms. I know I'm going to. I hope there's no Bedart families here. Anybody? I think our land is too valuable. The water is too valuable for dairies. The dairy guys came up and over the mountain from Chino and L.A. They sold out their land to developers. They came in, they didn't want to get out of the dairy business, the Dutch and the Azorean Portuguese. So they brought big herds and settled here. But when I talked to the Azorean Portuguese and Dutch, they always knew there was a time limit on this. Because dairy farming in a mega way, and yes, you get your digesters and they're trying to do some really creative stuff, but it's polluting the aquifer. And then on top of that, nothing uses more water than alfalfa. And our land is too valuable to really grow alfalfa. Now, they're using some drip systems in alfalfa to try to make that better. And yes, there's 5, 6 cuttings, so there's a way to calculate it so it doesn't look so bad. But I think alfalfa and dairies, how many dairy farmers are here tonight? Okay. I think that's something that has to change. I think the reduction of the footprint of ag through the Groundwater Sustainable Act, that's going to happen. I think the state should not be dictating to farmers what they grow. I think the farmer, the rest of it I'm talking about. Now, every crop has met glut. My grandfather came to Weed Patch in 1922 to work for Via Krikorian. He was the grape king, the raisin king. By 1922, he was bust. He had moved to L.A. They found oil beneath his land in Weed Patch, just to make it even worse. So, these gluts happen, and we have 1,400,000 acres of almonds. I drove up the state from Bakersfield all the way up to Chico in spring, and it was white everywhere. So there'll be an almond glut at some point. So, how many almond growers are here tonight? Yeah, I want to hear about that. Well, we could talk a little bit about that. I think, the price did drop a little bit, but it's still pretty good. Some almond guys have taken out almonds and gone to pistachios. The price is better there because the pistachio market is a monopoly, basically controlled by Resnick. Although now he's fighting with the Asimis, okay, because they want to do their own processing plant. And it's almost biblical, this fight. We'll see how it gets. So, anyhow, I think that's a little bit of the answer.
Next question here.
Mark, I watch Ryan Jacobson's show on PBS, Valley's Gold, and I see a lot of small family farms that grow row crops that really feed people. And then I drive up I-5 and I see a lot of nut trees. And we pride ourselves in being the breadbasket of the planet practically. But I don't see, actually, no disrespect, but I don't see how nuts sent to Asia really feed people. To me, it looks more like a luxury crop. So I don't really have a good feel for what the valley really is, and if we have a good balance. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, when we write about the valley, we say it's the most industrialized farm belt the world's ever known, and it's got 220, 250 different crops. I think that's still true, but those other crops are getting smaller and smaller and smaller as we're getting to specialty. And maybe we were all, if you look in 1920, each county was selling itself to investors and farmers to come because of the specialty markets. So we've always been specialty. It's ratcheted up more. The small guy is the small guy. It's so many issues. His children don't want to go into farming anymore. A lot of them. It's so hard, especially on the west side. If you have good water and you're near a river and you're farming good land. And I have a chapter here called Raisin Land in Selma and Fowler and Kingsburg. There's places all the way up to Delano where the soil is good, the water is easy, and a small guy can survive. But that's getting less and less, And it's just a tragedy what's happening out there. And at the end of this book, I'm on the farm with a family farmer named Jack Wolf in Westlands, and Jack is a family farmer at 25,000 acres. Different than what you're talking about.
Are there any farmers that want to say something tonight, or have a comment? No? Yeah? Yeah? No? Okay.
Were any of you at the meeting, at the pistachio meeting, where Resnick threatened Asimi? You were, huh?
I wasn't, but I certainly heard about it.
Yeah, Resnick's got a real temper. I mean, he wears this little red string around his wrist. And I asked him why, and he said he was taking Kabbalah, which is an ancient kind of religious sect within the Hebrew in Judaism. And I said, well, why is it there? He says, a reminder to try to keep my temper in check. But I guess he didn't do such a good job. So the reports are, as he said the F word, threw an F-bomb. That's true. Yeah. And so anyhow, it's an epic battle here over the control, because Resnick controls at certain points 40, 50, 60% of the pistachio market. Other guys are now coming in and processing. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Yes?
Okay, I farm almonds, pistachios, carrots, wheat, roses. So we do have a...
Roses, you in Wasco area?
Yes. And I'm not exactly sure what to ask you here, because I find it interesting what you're saying. Theoretically...
But go, talk real now, because, I'm...
Okay.
Yeah.
Compared to everything you're speaking about, I am a small farmer.
What do you got? Can you...
You want acres, right?
Well, yeah, it's the the worst question to ask somebody. But I'm
Yes.
guessing you're around 4,000 or something like that.
No, we're not.
You're not.
We're about half that.
Okay. That's a small farmer, by the way, today.
And one of the frustrations, I'll say, as a small farmer, you wonder why the small farms are falling by the wayside. And one of the reasons is not just because of the pure economics of the thing, but it has to do with our state government absolutely bombarding us with regulations. And they can, we feel like criminals out there for anything we do out there. And they're quick to fine us for violations of any kind, of which in the past, that was never particularly a consideration. We file reports, it seems like all day long. People have come up and asked, okay, well, what's your number one crop? And my number one answer is paper. And so what I'm suggesting here is the overheads that are being put on the smaller organizations are astronomical.
And then the cost of water on top. Are you part of the CVP, or are you part of the state? You're on the more eastern side of things?
We're part of the, we have part of the West, and we have part of the Kern River.
Okay. So you got some good water then on the Kern River stuff.
And so I kind of forgot my train of thought here that I was after, but I'm just trying to say that the small farmer is going to be, it's going to be harder and harder because of the overheads that are coming in. And so your big organizations who have the powerhouse of attorneys and all their negotiating and all their special heads that take care of these things can do it. But in our family farm, we wear a dozen different hats on the same desk. And we're part lawyer, we're part, negotiators, we're part of a lot of things. But we can't have the power that the bigger organizations can have or deal with. A little bit of a diversion here.
Sure.
I'm also negotiating on this high-speed rail. They're coming through some land. They're very hard on it, but we've been negotiating for years and years. And your comment about how you perceive that is exactly my perception also. In all our negotiations, we get, and maybe I'm not supposed to say some of this stuff, but we get tidbits of what their motives are. As you know, in 2008, California passed the proposition to float bonds for the rail.
Right.
And that was approximately $10 billion. And it promised not to be over $33 billion. And yet, they're going to spend $20 billion just from Bakersfield to Modesto. And it's, of course, been classified as a train to nowhere. But my point is that is not their real motive. Their real motive, and I'm going to blame Fresno a little bit about this, because at the time...
That's right.
At the time that it was supposed to go from San Francisco to Los Angeles, that was part of what you voted on, 2 hours and 40 minutes. They've diverted that through Fresno at the promotion of Fresno because they wanted a bedroom community, or build a bedroom community. And they're taking that, the same thing for Bakersfield. And I'm very distraught about this whole thing in that it's not going to be what everybody dreams it's going to be.
How many of you have issues with the train because you're afraid that it's going to be an incentive just to pave over the valley with houses? Okay, about a third. How many of you think it's going to modernize things and make living here, where we're easier access to the cities and things like that? That's a good idea. Okay, Not too, okay. Some of you are kind of ambivalent, which was
How
kind
many
of
of you think it's never going to happen?
yeah. You know, one of the things that I saw was when we built the system, the most magnificent system to move water that's ever been built in history. And what we created out of that, we created two, if you count San Diego, 3 world-class cities, a farm belt in the middle without parallel. But when we started that thing, we were 11 million people, and now we're 40 million. And the system is cracking. And it's not going to see us into a future of more nuts and more houses. Something's going to have to give. This book is basically me going into those cracks and trying to figure out, what's happening, where the future is on all this. And but we never talk about we never start with a number of how big can we get, how big can California get, and still have a reasonably good lifestyle and not have these water wars breaking out. That to me is the first question. When I was up in Portland, I saw something extraordinary. I'd always read about it, but Portland, every one of its communities continues to reinvent itself. It has an identity, a name, a vitality. And the reason why is they drew a line around Portland and said that this is farmland, and it'll always be farmland. And the farmers understood that. They didn't get in this game of what line you're on and, oh man, we could have sold out. And what that meant was that the money that was in Portland didn't keep fleeing to the fringe of town, the new town. It came back to the core, and the core kept reinventing. And we've never figured that out in California. That if we drew a line and said, this is protected farmland, it's not going to grow houses, it's going to grow crops. You'll see how these towns end up revitalizing instead of getting cannibalized and hollowed out. Fresno, in the center of Fresno, is essentially a crater. It's been hollowed out. It's some of the most impoverished neighborhoods in America. And it's like a mining town in that way. So that is something we should probably look at as well. I know some farmers will grumble because it's tough to farm, and selling out to a developer becomes that paycheck, that final retirement plan. But it's something we need to talk of as a state, and we didn't. Oddly enough, Pete Wilson was talking about it, but then, shied away from it in the end.
A couple more questions, Mike?
You touched early, Mark, on subsidence,
Yes,
over in
yeah.
Western Kern, and Lois and I have had several conversations about this, but it seems to be that from my conversations with Lois and others that it's principally an issue in Kings and Tulare and Western Fresno County, and it doesn't seem to have gotten down here, but it seems like you're talking about
the alluvial. There's a lot of the soils here are sandy, and this. You're right.
And so it's really compressed soils, which
clay soils.
Yeah, it seems to me that's sort of lost as an aquifer, but it seems to also have implications, say, for Kern and then counties to the north. And so you've talked about the Resnicks, and it's like they're bringing down water from Chico and Gridley
all sorts
and
of
places like that.
Yeah.
And it's like, so what are the implications for the rest of us as all this water's been sucked out of the ground? What's going to happen, in the future? What's your take on that?
So the aqueduct goes from, the Delta all the way along the west side. When I was out in the aqueduct with the successor to Joe Poland, it's a woman named Michelle Sneed. She was showing me that so much subsidence had taken place on the west side that the gravity flow of the aqueduct had been lost. There were huge entire pools. The aqueduct is really a bunch of pools that are connected. And there were huge pools where the gravity flow had been lost and the water was dead. And so our electrical costs are hundreds of millions of dollars extra to try to pump that water through those dead spots. And then you go to the east side, the Bryant Kern Canal, which comes down into Arvin Edison and then into the Kern River. That canal is also sinking near Terabella. Now, Terabella is a spot that probably should have never been farmed. They call it terrible because the land isn't so good. But it was able to ripen an early citrus to capture the Christmas market way back when. And that was the rise of Terabella. But it's been drained, and now the infrastructure of the canal has collapsed so much that water isn't pushing through. They've lost maybe 40 to 50% of their flow. And the debate now is who's going to pay for that? Should the farmers and the irrigation districts pay for that, or should we all pay for that? Okay, because their pumping caused it during drought. So, so your question about subsidence, it's the issue here in Kern isn't so much that the groundwater pumping is making the land sink. It's just that the groundwater pumping is going so far down that it's not sustainable, okay? And you're drying up, aquifers and stuff like that, not so much sinking them. And that deficit, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in Kern. I mean, I'm going to count on Lois's, being there. They will discover her at the next meeting, I'm sure, because she's writing something now. But what's going to happen with that law? Will it really lead to something?
Well, funny you should bring that up, because I was just in a meeting today where they were talking about, as part of SGMA, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, these districts are required to put out a report in April. And part of that report is going to be looking at subsidence. And there is some, I think Mark Mulcahy was talking about it, in the southern Kern Delta Water District area. So it's Lamont and that area. There's some subsidence over there. And then I had gone to the Eastern Thule GSA, Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and they were having a big to-do up there a couple of months ago, because right around the area that is sinking under the Friant Kern Canal, they're trying to figure out, is it deep pumping or is it shallow pumping? And it looks like it's the deep pumping, which of course is the big farmers, because they have the money to chase after that water. And so they're talking about fallowing land as part of trying to come into compliance with the Groundwater Management Act. But not all land is equal. They want to try and fallow that land that is causing the majority of that sinking. And of course, then you get into property rights and all kinds of fun stuff.
But he's correct, though, that the subsidence that's happening in Kern is nowhere near the level of some of these other places.
No, I mean, it's far worse in Tulare County.
Right.
And I've asked for some, geologists and stuff, and I don't really understand
It's really those old clays, the Corcoran clay level and things like that, Corcoran clay layer, and shallow and deep clay. And when that water gets drawn out, it just sucks down, and you have more alluvials here.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, two more questions.
Sure.
This gentleman here and then someone else, and then I'm sure these guys will speak to you afterwards individually. So
yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation, the talk. I wanted to ask you, Mark, specifically with regards to, I think the gentleman there kind of shared about sort of what are the actual opportunities for a small farmer left. In terms of my own family too, very much was part of that Selma belt, where you call that central area where a small person could get in. When I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, from Kern up to Sutter County, like Punjabis were buying land. Now all of us are getting to nuts and leaving grapes as quick as we can. And whether it be because of the tariffs, but also not just the water wars, just the labor shortage that has been devastating. You're seeing people leave the grapes on the vine this season. It's just not, they don't have the labor to even pick it. I'm a school board member in one of those areas that's hollowing out.
Where?
Central Unified.
Oh, yeah.
And while we're celebrating our increasing ADA, we know it's at the cost of Fresno Unified. And like you've kind of commented on, the SMUs are purchasing. I think you made a joke before that. What's the difference between a farmer is just a developer and just waiting for the right price?
Yeah, and waiting, yeah.
And so you're just seeing, I'm just so troubled in terms of, and I think as you hold that dissonance, oftentimes in your books and in your articles, that it's not an easy liberal story or a conservative story. These are people whose lives sometimes hang in the balance in every single which way. And I just wanted to commend you even on the latest book, because I just feel that constant dissonance inside which way should things be, which ways are things going. But I just wanted to just really appreciate the book.
You're seeing the idling of table grape land out there, or raisin land, Carruthers and places like that. Yeah, right. Right. I thought that artificial intelligence would actually, the mechanization would help the raisin, because they can, there's a variety of raisin called the Selma peat now, and a couple others that dry on the vine, and they literally take these fiberglass fingers and they shake them like this and vibrate and they drop. Because the raisin harvest is probably one of the most brutal kinds of work you can do. There's a whole scene in my book where I'm out in the land with folks from all over, and from Mexico, principally picking. And this isn't something that's been going on for a century and a quarter here. And it's piece rate, and it's really tough work. But I don't know that thing is going to happen enough to. I think they're all looking at returns, but it'll shift. There's never been a crop that has not met glut in the San Joaquin Valley or the Central Valley. They all meet glut. So it will happen, and there may be a day, I may not be around, where you're going to see the pulling out of almond trees. I actually saw it on Resnick's land. Pulled out almond trees, planted pistachios. But the small guy, man, yeah.
This is a climate change kind of a question. To what extent are farmers or researchers really thinking ahead to what adjustments they can make as our climate changes maybe in unexpected ways?
They're trying with different crops now to, different varieties of almonds and things like that maybe an almond that pollinates itself. There's been some success. Others that don't require the same chilling hours. How many of you grew up here in the valley? How many of you remember the Thule fog when it would set in and stay for 2-3 weeks? It was almost like a whiteout. I think the Thule fog has disappeared, don't you? I mean, it's hardly, when I cross the Kings River in the old Tulare Lake Basin, there's still some. But that fog created a blanket to keep the chill in and around those trees. So I think it's going to have profound changes. And then the rivers coming down in flood years, and they've now planted permanent crops in the lake bottom of Tulare Lake. I'm not sure in the next flood how that's going to, solve itself. But how many of you read the book? How many of you heard it on tape? So I got a chance to read the book on tape. Yeah, and I think I said somewhere else that it's the most miserable indoor job I've ever had in my life. First of all, it's 500 and some pages. It was exhausting. And then I had a producer in New York. He said, you have a pretty good voice to begin with, but people are going to be nauseated by that voice by the time you get to the end. So you need to vary this voice up. And so, geez, by the middle, he had me, I was like a thespian. I was, doing this and that, and so we finished it 8 hours a day. It was studio near the airport in Fresno. Every time an F-18 took off, we had to stop. Every time my stomach gurgled, which I didn't even know was happening, he would pick it up in New York. So we got to the end, and he said, you really learned well. I said, well, thank you. He said, so well that we're going to go back to chapters 1, 2, and 3 and read them again. So you're going to notice if you listen that some of I got it down in some parts and not in others. But I don't know how you could follow that book on tape necessarily, because it gets into some areas that are a little tougher to understand. So it's good to have I'm not trying to sell books here, by the way. Yes, I am. We're right back there, Russo's.
Yeah, Russo's.
But just trying to write this story and tell the story. The Valley really is kind of, it doesn't want to recognize its history. You go to these school districts, they're not reading, the stories of this place. They have a profound ignorance, maybe more than we did of this place. It's an incredible canvas, I'll tell one story. Driving down 99, seeing the boys of McFarland running, wondering what the heck are these guys doing, and getting on a bike and following them for 3 months, or the Black Okies living, no one had ever written about them. They're living in the alkali dust of Tulare and Kings County, and you just find them there. These stories where we've all grafted our narratives onto this land. All the immigration groups. I thought the Sikhs came here just in the last 20 years. No, some of the earliest folks that picked here were from the Punjabi region of India. Okay, so they came, and they keep continuing to come. My family came here. My grandfather in 1920, escaping the Armenian genocide. Back then, 3 years of working in weed patch, you could get enough money to buy your own vineyard. Good luck today. So, anyhow, this is a really encouraging turnout. I think it's fun. I dominated, unfortunately, Lois, but yeah. But we wanted to do it this way because usually I do a reading so you can hear the language and stuff like that. This is fun in its own way. It's a better way to interact. There's so few water journalists anymore as newspapers have imploded, and I just wish Lois the best as she starts this blog. I think that is the future of reporting. She can get some support, institutional support, maybe a wealthy patron. That's where we're going to get the stories, because no one's going to these
Nonprofit
meetings.
tax exempt.
Yeah. So, anyhow, thank you so much for showing up. I'd love to sign some books for you, the ones you've bought, if you want to get some more. And thank you for the wonderful reception here. Thank you for the university. I neglected to say, the library here supported this. Jennifer's help. The professor, is the professor here from the history department?
Right there.
Where's she at? Thank you so much for your help. Anyhow, Councilman, thank you for coming. Everybody. Thank you.